Hey, what's up? Welcome back to Music Theory Logic. My name's Andrew, also known as d.r.u, drusound, author of Music Theory for Electronic Producers, linked below. And today is going to be a little breakout sound design session from my Music Theory breakdown on Tommy's Theme by Noisia. If you haven't seen this, I will link to that hopefully on the side. So pause this and go check out the full breakdown. But we're going to talk about how I built the Serum sounds for that track. So if you haven't heard that, I encourage you to go listen to the breakdown because I talk about like the notes and the structure of the song, and I go over the basses a little bit. But I'm gonna go ahead and play just from the string breakdown into the drop, the first section. We're gonna talk about all of the drop sounds and building them in Serum. Here we go. Here's that section. All right. I say this in the breakdown, but I'm going to say it again. I'm going to be the first to admit that those do not sound on the level of Noisia's basses from Tommy's theme. In case you didn't know, Noisia are amongst a handful of producer groups that like I would label as some of the like biggest pioneers of modern dance music. I was fortunate enough to see Noisia perform a show that was called Noisia Presents at Amsterdam Dance Event in 2014. Saw Chase and Status there as well, which was amazing. And so even if I spent countless times, I don't think I could fully 100% recreate the sound. Now, part of the reason for that isn't just the fact that I'm not as good as Noisia. I'll be the first to admit that. I'm practicing all the time. Hopefully I get better. But at the end of the day, there are three of them. There's one of me, so I at least always have that at my side. But one of the things about Noisia that I discovered after researching them, like many artists that I've been into, there's video that Future Music put out with Noisia where they're talking about their sound design method, and they use a lot of modular synths. So one trick to replicating a sound of anything is to use the same gear that whatever it was made on used. Now, I don't have access to a bunch of modular rigs in my studio. I look at Euro rack cases and plan on building a modular synth as soon as I feasibly can get those funds together. But basically, like many of you that don't have modular synths, if you have one third-party VST, it's probably Serum, especially if you make drum and bass or dubstep or trap music or house music or anything electronic. Serum is made by Steve Duda's company, Extra Records. It's hands down the most cost-efficient synthesizer for what it is. I think the price is up to like $180, and you can actually pay that over time. So this isn't a Serum advertisement, but that's the synth that I used. So we're going to talk about two main patches, and everything else is kind of a variation of these main two patches. So the first bass that we hear is this one. It's not going to sound too exciting on its own, but it sounds like this. All right, so let's talk about what's happening. This is a really, really simple patch. Basically using two oscillators. I'm using oscillator A and B. On oscillator A, I'm using Cymatics FM Table 12. And then on oscillator B, I'm using 4088. Both of them are just one voice. The oscillator A has FM from B turned on, It's a very small parameter, but you'll notice that does a lot, so you need it to be pretty small. And then I have LFO3 that's at a quarter note. The basic shape is tied to our FMB. Now, this really isn't the full sound. If I were to take off our distortion and hyperdimension expander, it's not going to sound nearly as interesting. All right, so some of the real character of the sound comes from mainly the distortion and this hyperdimension expander. So I have that same LFO that was controlling the FM from B on oscillator A is tied to the drive amount on sine fold, our distortion mode, and then on our hyper expander. This is a unison of 4, and then it has the mix wheels going from basically 0 to like, what is that? Like 33%. 0 to a third, also tied to the LFO1. So what that does is it creates movement in the sound. Basically, in Serum, the way you do that is you drag your LFO to whatever parameter. So let's say I got rid of this modulator again without the distortion moving. It sounds like this. Little movement, but if I add in this drive, and again I go from 0 to like a third, it's going to sound like this. So you can really hear a lot is happening from that drive being changed from the LFO. So again, this isn't identical to the Noisia sound. That's why I called this Noisia-ish bass. I do that a lot of times when I create something that's based on an artist, but not exactly like what that artist has done, which is kind of the beauty of trying to do this. You're never going to get it like perfect to the sound, but what's kind of cool about that is it becomes kind of your own. So our second synth sounds like this. All right. And basically that's using 2 LFOs. So first of all, I'm using oscillator A and B again. I'm using Cymatic's Demon, the Demon wavetable. And then I'm using just our default initial oscillator. Now you'll notice that I'm not actually playing any sound from that, but once again, I'm FMing from B. I'm doing more FM this time. So essentially you need oscillator B turned on for that to even work to FM from the B. You don't need volume there, so there's no volume on the actual thing that's controlling the FM for oscillator A. Where then also I have LFO1 tied to the wavetable position. Then in our effects chain, I'm using the hyperdimension expander again. I'm using the phaser, and then I'm also using our filter. Now, LFO1 is tied to the cutoff of this low-pass filter. So what that's doing is creating a lot of the talking sort of sound. If I turn off our phaser and hyperdimension expander, we still get some of the metallic sounds, but what's really going to build the sound is LFO2. So if you go to LFO2, this is a half note ramping up shape, and that is basically tied to the phaser, the mix knob of the phaser, and then the mix knob of the hyperdimension expander. What that does is the phaser is bringing out more metallic sort of harmonics as it goes from over the course of the half note from 0 to 100%. And then it's also increasing the mix of our hyper expander. That's what's kind of making the bass sound like it gets bigger as it goes throughout. Once again, it sounds like this. Cool. Then we hear this other lead variation, which is the same, built on the same patch, but sounds like this. Cool. So this lead variation 3 is what I'm calling it. Once again, it's essentially the same patch. That is The LFO is controlling the same things, the same wavetables. The one thing I didn't mention of that patch was our filter. The filter is on flange minus. It's tied to oscillator A and B. It's important it's tied to B as well because that is also what's bringing out harmonics of this FM. Then LFO1 is controlling the cutoff of that. Really small parameter, but it does a lot. The main difference that's happening is all of a sudden, instead of us being tied, it was a quarter note before, it was tied to the BPM. We have it, instead of BPM, at our LFO anchor, all right? So it's not synced to the global song position in BPM mode. So it's purely a rate that's not tied to like the rhythm of our track. So that's at 1,000 hertz, and that's what gives that bass, makes it sound like it's moving. So during the course of that note at 1,000 hertz or 1 hertz, it's basically happening 3 times from the beginning. That's what makes it sound like it's restarting. Cool. Moving along in our sort of in-between section when we get back to C sharp minor, if you did see that breakdown, we have this lead variation 2 and 1. I basically built them in this order. That's where the number comes from. In order of hearing them, the second lead variation is, again, really just the speed or the rate of the LFO is the only thing that's changed. Now, you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't you just automate the rate? Why create 3 different layers? Let's look at lead variation 1. This also has a different rate. It looks to be the same other stuff. So this next variation is the same. So again, the only difference between these 3 channels or 4 channels is basically the rate of the LFO1. The reason I duplicate the synth and I'm doing them on their own channel is that it can make it a lot easier, especially if the LFO rates are static. You can draw in automation, and I do that a lot on my like rhythm type basses, or if you check out my my cap slap remix sort of like submission that's on my Audius, also linked below in the drop, you'll hear like this whole wall of synths that is moving, and I'm basically changing the rate, like the speed of it, by automating the LFO pattern. But that doesn't work as well inside of Logic, at least, or Ableton. If we really need the LFO timing to be perfect, the more busy your session gets, the more your computer is going to start like cutting shortcuts. And sometimes where you like see an automation line isn't exactly where you hear it, especially in context of all that other stuff happening. So a couple tricks there. One, bouncing to audio is your best friend. The reason I didn't do that here is I wanted to be able to do this video and show you all of the different patches that are happening. But if I didn't want to do that, what I would kind of do is basically bounce this to audio, change the LFO rate, bounce it to audio, change the LFO rate, repeat. Cool. So let's go to drop 2 because we've basically covered all of the sounds. We have this first thing that happens at the beginning of drop 2, and that's a variation of our Noisia-ish bass, the first sound I showed you. Sounds like this, coming out of the strings. Cool. So that's this patch, and again, it's built on the same stuff, is the same wavetables and a lot of the similar tying of our LFO. There's a couple things that have changed. So one, our LFO shape has changed. You may remember it was that basic sort of up then down, like triangle looking thing. I changed that shape. I then took it off of BPM tied. I made it 1.3 hertz, although we're going to talk about that. This rate is going to change, and I do have it automated, and I'll show you that in a second. So LFO 1 has, I think it had 4 things it was controlling before, now it's 7. So oscillator 1, still FM table 12, still FMing from B. That parameter is still the same. The difference is now we have 5 voices instead of 1. We're automating that detune, so we don't really hear the multiple voices, and then we hear that like super, when you have like a bunch of parallel voices, I always think super saw. So it's not a saw, but it'd be like a super FM table 12. Then the main thing, this is also really important, is it's tied to the level of both oscillator A and B. So these 2 oscillators are the only 2 things in the synth patch that are creating sound. So all of the sound starts at these 2. I have LFO tied to the volume of those oscillators, and what that does is it makes it stutter. Every time this LFO1 is at the bottom, it's going to, we're not going to hear the volume of oscillator A or B. When it's maxed out, we're going to hear it at the top of where that pink line is. Cool. If your Serum looks different than mine, you may be wondering what's up with that. I'm using a skin. Skins are super cool, and a lot of the cool kids, like the artists out there, have their own Serum skins. So you can like find, I think Reddit has a forum where they list that you can basically download these. There's all sorts of really, really cool Serum patches. I think this is Virtual Riot's, except I think I took off some of the graphics from him, so you can also customize a skin yourself. So let's hear that bass one more time. The only other thing I'll talk about is LFO, our LFO1. So first of all, LFO1 is still controlling the hyper dimension expander, this mix. It's also controlling the drive. It's the same kind of distortion, so nothing's changed here. We're compressing everything. But what has changed is on our LFO2, this is really subtle, but I have it tied to the coarse pitch of LFO1. So what that does is it basically makes the sound go up in pitch, and it's really subtle, but it adds to like the dissonance of this, and with my ear I felt like I needed that to make it sound closer to the original sound. So the final thing that we have to talk about with this sound is basically this LFO line. So the way I access this, the way I like to, is taking the channel that I'm on, turning it to touch, hitting play, moving that line. That's then going to create the automation line. When you hit A in Logic, you're going to see automation. You might have to drop down on this menu so that you see the LFO1 automation. But then you can change the line. Again, an important thing to remember when you're doing this kind of stuff is that where you see the line isn't necessarily where it's happening. Because again, we're on a computer, and there's a lot of stuff happening that I'm nowhere near qualified to tell you, but I know that inside our computer there is all sorts of calculations and crazy stuff happening all the time, and I'm guessing that some of that crazy stuff is what makes this crazy stuff act even weirder. Lots of use of the word crazy, but basically as this line changes, it's changing the rate of LFO1. So if we pull up that synth and we watch this parameter down here, this rate of LFO1, we're going to see it change. It's at 1.3. Then as I drag it, you can actually see it change. So 2.8, 6.8, that's the 14.8. If we hit play, we're going to hear that as that speed changes, the rate of the stutter changes, and how the synth is moving changes. That sounds like this. And you probably heard the pitch going up. Wow, it's going up as it climbs. And again, that's our LFO1 tied to our coarse pitch. So that was pretty expedited. If you are not familiar with Serum, perhaps I went a little too fast on that. I apologize. But one thing I would tell you is just the cool thing about these videos is they're still out there. So you can pause it, you can restart it. One thing that's helpful is you could have Serum open on your system, and you could basically follow along as I'm creating the sound. And that will give you the patch as well when you're done with it. But it's also a little bit easier. The second thing or final thing I'll say is that I'm the first one to admit when I got into dance music production, I got into dance music production after basically being a guitarist in a band. and all of the ideas of oscillators and synthesizers and like all that stuff seemed like something I would never understand. And I'll be the first to admit that I do not have like a god level synthesis understanding. I feel like when I watch OS like AU5 or watch Virtual Riot, I feel like they're way better than I am with Serum, and they probably are, but perhaps they would agree with me. Maybe they disagree, but I feel like in synthesis or in musicianship in general, like you always can get better. Like there is no finish line, and that's really kind of cool. All that to say that if you found this discouraging, don't be discouraged. Just get in and try to play with whatever synthesizer you're using. If you don't have Serum, a fun exercise with this video would be to try to see if with your synthesizer, whether it's like Operator from Ableton or you're using like ES2, some default Logic synth, or you're in an FL Studio, or maybe you have like Massive or Silent or some other third-party synth, but try to use that synth to build these Noisia basses, and let's see if that works. If you have any questions, comments, leave them in the comments. I would love to hear what you're thinking. And if you did get some help from this video, you would help me out a ton by subscribing to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications so you find out when I make a new video. Once again, my name was Andrew. Thanks for tuning into Music Theory Logic. I always say this at the end, but try to be nice to your fellow human being. That makes it more enjoyable time on this crazy planet. For all of us, I think we can all be kind to each other. On that note, have a wonderful rest of your day and make some awesome music. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.